"Show me where it hurts," he said softly. And in a room full of men who had killed without blinking, every single one of them went still, because Dante Vukovic, the man this city called the Devil, the Iron King, the ghost who owned the harbor, and everyone who breathed near it, never, ever spoke softly. Not when he ordered a debt collected, not when he ended a life, not when he buried his own father in the rain 3 winters ago, and the softness in his voice now was more terrifying than any roar could ever have been. He was crouched in front of her, this man who made governments nervous, this man carved from shadow and cold marble, kneeling on the blood-stained floor of his own glass tower, as if the woman trembling in the chair were the only altar he had ever knelt at in his life. Mira Ellison could not stop shaking. Her lip was split, and the metal taste of it filled her mouth. There was a bruise blooming purple along her jaw in the shape of a man's knuckles, and her wrist was cradled against her chest at an angle that was wrong. And she was trying so hard to make herself smaller the way she had made herself smaller her entire life, to disappear into the upholstery, to take up less room, because taking up less room was the only apology her body had ever known how to offer the world. "Show me where it hurts," he said again. And his hand, that enormous, scarred, lethal hand that had broken bones and signed death warrants without a flicker of conscience, hovered an inch from her cheek, not touching, only asking. And the room held its breath. Renzo, his lieutenant, a slab of a man who had stood at Dante's shoulder through a decade of bloodshed and never once flinched, took a slow half-step backward. The 2 soldiers by the elevator found the floor very interesting, because they had all seen the Devil furious. They had seen him glacial. They had never once in their lives seen him afraid. And what rolled off him now, filling the cavernous 40-foot room with its terrible pressure, was the specific, world-ending fear of a man who has just understood that the single thing he could never afford to lose had been bleeding alone while he was somewhere else. "Tell me their names," he whispered to her, and then, louder, rising to his full height so that he seemed to blot out the floor-to-ceiling lights of the skyline behind him, he turned to the room, to the city, to whatever god was listening. "Bring me every man who touched her. I do not care if I have to burn this city to the bedrock. Tonight the harbor runs red." For 10 years, this city had told stories about Dante Vukovic, the way frightened people tell stories about the weather, as a force that arrived without warning and left nothing standing. And in every one of those stories, he was alone, because the legend agreed on one thing above all else, that the Devil loved no one and feared nothing, that there was no door into him, no soft place where a knife could slide. The legend was wrong. There was a door. Her name was Mira, and someone had just made the catastrophic mistake of walking through it. This is the story of how the most ruthless man alive met the one soul he would unmake the world for, and how the quiet woman everyone overlooked became the queen of a kingdom built on fear. But to understand the blood, you have to go back to the silence, back to before any of them knew her name. Back to a girl who had spent 31 years learning to be invisible, and a king who, against every law he had ever lived by, could not stop seeing her. 3 weeks earlier, Mira Ellison had walked into the Meridian Tower, carrying a battered leather satchel and the unshakable certainty that she did not belong. She was a forensic accountant, the best in the state and paid like the worst. A woman who could look at 4,000 transactions and feel the one lie inside them, the way other people felt, a draft under a door. She was soft where the world told her she should be sharp, full where magazines told her she should be empty, and she had long ago stopped expecting anyone in a room to look at her twice. So when the most dangerous man in the city looked at her once and then looked again, she assumed she had imagined it. Mira had been hired through 6 layers of shell companies to audit the books of a logistics empire that everyone pretended was clean. She did not ask what the empire really moved through its container ships at 3 in the morning. She had learned that some questions were a kind of suicide. Her job was the numbers, and the numbers. When she finally pried them open on the 14th floor, under a flickering fluorescent light everyone else had gone home to avoid, were screaming. $41 million had walked out of the Vukovic organization across 19 months, siphoned in amounts small enough to look like rounding, routed through a freight forwarder in the harbor district, laundered so cleverly that 99 accountants out of 100 would have signed off and gone home. Mira was the 100th, and being the 100th had cost her every promotion, every friend who wanted her to look away, every comfortable life she might have had if she had only learned to see a little less. She sat very still in that empty office and understood two things at once. The first was that someone close to the throne, someone trusted, someone who shook the devil's hand and called him brother, was robbing him blind. The second was that she was now the only living person outside that conspiracy who knew it, and that knowledge was a loaded gun she was holding by the barrel. She should have closed the file. She should have written a soft, useless report full of words like discrepancy and recommend further review, taken her fee, and vanished. Instead, because she was honest in a way that had cost her every comfortable thing she had ever almost had, she kept pulling the thread. And somewhere up on the 60th floor, in a study lined with books he actually read, Dante Vukovic was already watching the cameras, already noticing that the heavy-set woman with the kind eyes and the satchel was the only one in the building who never stopped working, the only one who treated his money like it mattered, the only one who, when she thought no one could see, pressed a hand to her own stomach and looked at her reflection in the black window with an apology in her eyes that made something in his chest go quietly, dangerously soft. He had built his entire life on noticing what others missed. He had simply never expected the thing he noticed to be a person who looked back at him, without fear, and also without the hunger he saw in everyone else. The hunger for his money, his protection, his terrible blessing. He had watched, on a gray Tuesday, 3 junior associates in good suits laugh behind their hands when she reached for a second pastry in the lobby cafe. And he had watched her set it back down again, untouched, and press that same hand to her stomach with that same small apology, and something cold and surgical had happened in his chest. By the end of that hour, all 3 associates had been reassigned to the worst accounts in the worst city the organization touched, and none of them ever learned why, and Mira never knew it had happened at all. That was how he loved before he understood it was love, in silences and consequences she could not see. Mira wanted nothing from him. She did not even know yet that he existed as anything but a name on a door, and that, more than any gown or any gala, was the beginning of the end of his cold and well-defended heart. The man stealing from Dante Vukovic was named Aldo Bianchi, and he had a smile like a wet knife. He was a capo, a made man, the son of the devil's father's oldest friend, and for 19 months he had believed himself untouchable, which is the precise belief that gets careless men killed. When his contact inside the Meridian whispered that a freelance auditor had flagged the freight forwarder, Aldo did not panic, because panic was for amateurs. He simply decided to make the problem disappear the way he made all his problems disappear, quietly in the dark, where no one important would ever look. He could not have known that the auditor was already the most important person in the building to the one man he should have feared. On a Thursday night, when Mira left the tower late with a flash drive heavy in her pocket and proof folded against her heart, 2 men were waiting in the parking structure. She heard the footsteps and her whole body remembered, the way bodies do, every time she had ever been cornered, every cruelty disguised as a joke, every hand that had grabbed without asking, and she ran, and she was not fast, and they caught her between a concrete pillar and a black sedan. They wanted the drive. She would not give them the drive. It was the bravest and stupidest thing she had ever done, and she did it because somewhere under all that learned smallness, she had always been made of iron. She had simply never been given a reason to swing. The first blow took her across the jaw. The second cracked her wrist when she threw it up to protect her face. They called her names while they hit her. The old names, the cruel ones about her size, the words that had followed her through every locker room and every bad date and every doctor who had blamed her body for everything. And Aldo's man leaned down and said she should be grateful, that a woman like her should be grateful anyone touched her at all. And Mira, with blood in her mouth and her wrists screaming and her vision going white at the edges, did the thing none of them expected, the thing she would not fully understand until much later. She closed her broken hand around that flash drive and she said no. Just that. One small word from a woman they had been told was too soft to fight and too grateful to refuse, and it stopped them for half a second out of pure disbelief. And then there was a sound. Tires, low and fast, then doors, then a stillness so total it was its own kind of scream. Renzo had seen her on the camera feed Dante now insisted on watching personally. Renzo had made one call, and the devil had come down 60 floors in 90 seconds. And when he stepped into the white light of that parking structure and saw her crumpled against the pillar with blood on her face and her arm held wrong, something behind his eyes that had been holding the line for 40 years simply broke. He did not roar. Not yet. He crossed the concrete with a calm so absolute that Aldo's two men, killers both, took an involuntary step back. He looked at the blood on her mouth. He looked at the way she was still, even now, even broken, trying to fold herself smaller, and he said the only thing his ruined heart could find, kneeling in the oil and the glass. "Show me where it hurts." That was the first time. The room that held its breath then was made of concrete and fear, and it would not be the last. What happened to Aldo Bianchi's two men in the next 11 minutes is not the kind of thing one says aloud, and Mira did not see it because Dante had already lifted her, with a gentleness that did not match a single other thing about him, and carried her to the car like she weighed nothing at all, like she were not the size the whole world had spent her life punishing her for, like she were treasure he had finally found. He held her against his chest in the back of the Maybach, and she could feel his heart going like a war drum, even though his hands were perfectly steady. And he murmured to her the entire drive, low and unbroken, "You are safe now. You are safe. No one will ever touch you again. I have you. I have you." And Mira, who had never in her life been held by someone who did not eventually want something back, wept into the lapel of a suit that cost more than her apartment, and could not have said whether it was the pain or the impossible tenderness that undid her. He took her not to a hospital, but to the 60th floor of the Meridian, where a private doctor was already waiting, summoned by a single word from Renzo. The wrist was fractured, not shattered. The jaw would bruise for a fortnight. There was nothing broken that would not mend, the doctor said, and Dante stood in the corner with his arms folded and his face a granite mask, and only Mira, watching him, saw the muscle jumping in his jaw, saw the way his eyes never left her, saw that the Iron King was holding himself together by a thread thinner than the one she had pulled in the books. When the doctor left, the city outside the glass went on glittering, as if nothing had happened, as if a woman had not just been beaten in a parking garage for the crime of being honest. Mira sat on the edge of an enormous bed in a borrowed shirt, and she was ashamed, the old shame, the bone-deep certainty that she was too much and not enough all at once, and she pulled the shirt tighter and wouldn't look at him. And Dante Vukovic, who had ordered the deaths of better men than Aldo over less, crossed the room and crouched in front of her again, the way he had on the concrete, putting himself below her, this man who had never been below anyone. "Look at me," he said. She did. "They told you that you should make yourself small," he said, and it was not a question. "Every one of them, your whole life. They taught you to apologize for the room you take up." Her eyes filled. He took her uninjured hand in both of his enormous ones, and he held it like a relic. "Listen to me. because I will only say it once, and then I will spend the rest of my life proving it. There is not 1 inch of you that is too much. You are not a thing to be tolerated. You are the only honest person who has ever walked into my house, and you are the bravest, and I have known many beautiful things and ruined most of them, the single most beautiful. They hit you because they were afraid of what you found. I will teach this city to be afraid of what happens to anyone who lifts a hand to you. You are not too much, Mira. You are exactly what I have spent my whole cold life needing to hold. And then, because he was a man who proved things rather than only saying them, he did something no one had done since she was a child. He sat beside her on the edge of that enormous bed, careful and unhurried, and he simply held her against the broad warmth of him, without flinching from any part of her. Without 1/2 second of the hesitation she had braced for her entire life. And she felt the truth of his words settle into her body, the way the lie of every cruelty had once settled, permanently, irreversibly, rewriting something she had thought was carved in stone. And the queen, though she did not yet know she was one, finally looked at herself in the dark mirror of the window and did not flinch. But Dante Vukovic had not built an empire on tenderness, and tenderness was not what the night required. While Mira slept finally under guard, in the safest room in the city, he went to war. He gathered his lieutenants in the war room on the 59th floor, and he laid the city out on the table like a body to be opened, and he was no longer soft. "Someone stole 41 million from me, he said, and when an honest woman found it, they put their hands on her. I want the man who gave the order, and I want the man who carried it out, and I want everyone who knew and said nothing." Renzo, who had been with him longest, said the name he had already guessed. Aldo Bianchi. The freight forwarder in the harbor was Aldo's. The smile was Aldo's. The arrogance was Aldo's. And the betrayal, the unforgivable thing, that a man who had eaten at Dante's table and stood at his father's grave had decided that a curvy, kind, brilliant stranger was a problem to be erased rather than a debt to be feared. That was the most Aldo thing of all. Dante locked the city down. He had the docks watched, the airfields papered, the bridges quietly bought. He sent men to every property Aldo owned and 3 that he thought were secret. He called in markers a decade old, a harbor master who owed him a son's life, a customs official who owed him a daughter's, a judge who owed him nothing at all, but understood which way the wind had turned. The phones of the powerful lit up in the small hours with a single message, that the devil's grace was suspended until he had what he wanted, and that any man who sheltered Aldo Bianchi before sunrise was choosing to share his fate. By dawn, he had Aldo's accountant, a soft and sweating man who gave up the freight forwarder, the offshore accounts, and the name of the rival, a slick out-of-town money man named Vincent Crane, who had been bankrolling Aldo's quiet coup, planning to hollow out the Vukovic empire from the inside and walk away with the harbor before anyone noticed it was gone. So there it was. Not 1 snake, but 2, coiled together. And in the middle of it all, the only clean thing, the only true thing, was a woman with a fractured wrist who had refused to hand over a flash drive to 2 armed men because the numbers were right and the lie was wrong. Dante stood at the window as the sun came up bloody over the water and made himself a promise that he had not made since he was a boy kneeling at another grave. He would not simply win. He would make it so that the story of what happened to anyone who hurt her would be told in this city for 100 years, told in whispers, told to frightened children and grown men alike, told so that Mira Ellison would walk every street she ever walked again, wrapped in an invisible armor made entirely of other people's fear. The raid came the next night. Aldo had gone to ground in a fortified warehouse on the harbor, ringed with men who thought concrete and rifles could keep the devil out. They were wrong. Renzo took the loading dock. Dante walked in the front. There is a particular silence that falls over violent men when the thing they have been told their whole lives is only a legend turns out to be standing in the doorway. And that silence fell now. He did not hurry. He walked the length of that warehouse through men who had been paid to be brave and discovered, in the presence of the real thing, that they were not. And the few who reached for their weapons learned that Renzo and the others had already come in behind them through the dark, and the rest simply set their rifles down on the wet concrete and stepped back against the walls as if distance could save them. Glass crunched under his shoes. Somewhere water dripped. By the time it ended, Aldo Bianchi was on his knees on the wet floor of his own warehouse, and the devil was looking down at him without any anger at all, which was the most frightening thing Aldo had ever seen. Aldo talked, the way they always talk at the end, when the smile is gone and the wet knife is just a frightened man's mouth. He gave up Vincent Crane. He gave up the roots, the accounts, the timeline, the whole rotten architecture of the theft, and he begged, invoking Dante's father, invoking brotherhood, invoking 40 years of borrowed loyalty. And Dante crouched in front of him, the way he had crouched in front of Mira, mirror images, the tender and the terrible, and he said only this: "I would have forgiven you the money. Money is just numbers, and numbers can be rebuilt by someone who understands them better than you ever will. But you put your hands on her. You called her names her own mother once called her. You decided she was small enough to break." He stood. He did not raise his voice. "She is the queen of the city. And you are about to become a story people tell to keep their children indoors." What happened to Aldo settled the harbor for a generation. But Vincent Crane was the smarter snake, and he had already smelled the smoke and run, fleeing toward a private airfield with the last of the stolen money and a forged passport and the smug certainty of a man who has always escaped before. He very nearly made it. What he had not counted on, what no one had ever counted on, was Mira. Because while the devil fought his war with guns and fear, Mira Ellison had been fighting hers with the only weapon that had never once failed her. From the safe room, with a borrowed laptop and a splinted wrist and a cup of tea going cold beside her, she had taken the contents of that flash drive she had nearly died protecting, and she had unraveled Vincent Crane's entire financial soul. She found the offshore shells inside shells, the kind of architecture that took most investigators years, and took her one long sleepless night because she had spent a lifetime learning to see exactly the thing other people were trained to slide their eyes past. She mapped the money the way a surgeon maps a body, every artery, every hidden chamber, every place a clever man had tried to make a fortune vanish, and one by one she lit them up. She found the airfield by tracing a fuel payment he thought was invisible. She found the tail number of the jet, the bank in the islands waiting to receive him, and the single fatal mistake, a recurring wire to a numbered account that, when she pulled the final thread, turned out to belong to Crane himself under a name he had used decades ago and forgotten he had ever buried. She did not hand the file to Dante and step back. She walked into the war room, bruised and limping and magnificent, and she put it on the table among the hardened killers, and she said, in a voice that did not tremble at all, "Not anymore. He thinks he is flying to freedom in 40 minutes. He is flying to whatever you decide. I have his tail number, his destination, and enough proof to bury him in 12 countries. The numbers were always going to be how this ended. You just needed someone who could read them." And the war room, full of men who killed for a living, went silent and held its breath, and Renzo, who did not impress easily, looked at the devil and then looked at the woman and understood, the way the whole organization would soon understand, that the king had not found a treasure to protect. He had found his equal. Dante crossed to her. He did not care that 30 men were watching. He took her face in his hands, careful of the bruise, and he looked at her the way no one had looked at her in 31 years, like she was the answer to a question he had stopped asking long ago. "Marry me," he said, or do not. I will love you either way until I am in the ground. But God help me, woman. Marry me." And she laughed with her split lip in front of 30 hardened men, and the sound of it changed the temperature of the whole cold tower. And Renzo, who had not smiled in living memory, turned his head to hide that he was smiling now. Vincent Crane never made his flight. The jet was held quietly by men who answered to a power Crane had badly underestimated, and the evidence Mira had assembled went, in carefully sealed pieces, exactly where it would do the most damage, to authorities Dante owned and authorities he did not. So that Crane's empire collapsed in a single week in headlines and indictments and frozen accounts, a public ruin to match Aldo's private one. And the 41 million found its way home to the last cent because Mira insisted, because the numbers had to balance. And the night the final wire cleared, she closed the ledger and felt a satisfaction deeper than revenge. The clean and total satisfaction of a thing made right by the one person who had refused to let it stay wrong. The story spread the way Dante had promised it would. They said the devil of the harbor had a queen now, and that the men who hurt her had simply ceased to exist, and that she was soft and kind and dangerous in a way none of them could name, and that you did not so much as raise your voice near her unless you were tired of breathing. And within a month, no one in the city would have dreamed of looking at Mira Ellison the way the whole world had looked at her for 31 years. She stopped folding herself smaller. She had a gown made, not for revenge. There was no party to crash, no head table to conquer. The war was already won, but simply because she wanted to. A column of deep red silk built by a designer who wept when he saw how she filled it, who said he had waited his whole career for a body that commanded a room instead of apologizing to it. Cut to celebrate every curve the cruel had once policed, beaded by hand over 3 days by women who were told only that they were dressing a queen. And when she stood in front of the mirror in the 60th floor suite, the night of the only party that mattered, a quiet one, just the two of them and the skyline, she did not see too much. She saw a queen. Dante came to stand behind her, his chin against her hair, his arms wrapped around the body he treated like the rarest thing he had ever owned, and he met her eyes in the glass. "Show me where it hurts," he said again, softly, the old words, but it was a different question now, and the answer, for the first time in her entire guarded life, was nowhere, nowhere at all. "It does not hurt anymore." And he kissed her bruise where the bruise had been, and her wrist where the bones had healed stronger, and her mouth like a man at prayer. And the Iron King who frightened nations held the woman the world had overlooked as if he had been carved by the gods, every cruel and lethal inch of him, for this one tender purpose and no other. And listen, you, yes you, still watching, still here. Because if your heart is pounding even half as hard as mine was while this came together, then you already know we are not nearly done, because there are secrets in Vincent Crane's frozen accounts that point higher than anyone dared guess, and an enemy who has been watching the devil fall in love and deciding that love is a weakness to be exploited, and a wedding that half this city would kill to stop. And I am telling you, the next chapter is bigger and darker and more breathtaking than anything you just witnessed. So do this for me. If Mira's transformation gave you chills, if you cheered when the war room held its breath, smash that like button right now, so this story reaches every person who needs to believe that the overlooked ones are the most powerful of all. Share it with the one friend who has spent too long making herself small. Drop a comment and tell me, in that parking garage, in that war room, what was the exact moment you fell for them? I read every single one. And subscribe, truly subscribe, and hit that notification bell. Because the moment the next chapter drops, you are going to want to be first through the doors, first into the room that holds its breath, first to find out what the devil does when someone finally, foolishly, threatens his queen.